Hello and welcome to Forever Learning Month. My name is Bob Reilly, former Assistant Dean at Fordham Law School. It's my pleasure to take you back to Rose Hill for an experience that I think will be interesting and enlightening. Some may be wondering why it is that I'm giving this tour today. I came to Fordham many years ago as a freshman in the undergraduate school, and I didn't know anything about the Jesuits. I didn't have Jesuits in high school. I really knew nothing about them. But shortly after arriving, I began to see Jesuits walking around the campus wearing long cassocks. It pretty much answered the question for me, and I didn't investigate it much beyond that. As I came back many years later to be assistant dean at the law school, I spent more time on the subject and learned about it and found so many interesting things that when I would take my friends and walk around campus and tell them the facts, they were astonished. And I hope you'll be astonished as together today we walk around taking a tour called Hidden in Plain Sight, Discovering the Jesuit Presence at Rose Hill. The only way to begin talking about the Jesuits is to start with St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. Because his story and the things he wrote and the things he said and the things he decided have shaped the Jesuits for centuries, 5 centuries. And they talk about him today almost as if he's still over there in Rome. Ignatius was born in northern Spain, and he had intended to live a life of a courtier, they say. His family was reasonably well off, but he made his career in the army. And he was engaged in battle at the age of about 30, and he was grievously wounded in the Battle of Pamplona. Now, I've read recently about how in the American Civil War time, if you were seriously injured, 80% of those who were seriously injured died. And that was 3 centuries later. So the type of medicine that must have been practiced in the 1500s would certainly have been minimal, really, by our standards. It took him 3 years to recover. He was badly damaged leg, and he was confined to a family residence. Fortunately, he had the ability to read, and he had only 2 books, and he read those books over and over and over again. The books were The Life of Christ and The Lives of the Saints. But Ignatius brought a very special quality to his reading. The quality was a quality of imagination. Not that he was imagining things, but he could visualize things. He could visualize the stories he read. He could visualize them as if he was part of it, standing there watching it. And you know, even if you're not part of something that is happening, but you are present, you can feel it. If there's joy, if there's a wedding, a birth of a baby, you can feel great joy. If there's sorrow, you can feel it even if you're not directly involved. And he had that ability. It changed his life. It set him on a whole new path. Even though he was grievously injured, walked with a limp for the rest of his life, he started on a new path. And he had decided that he was going to follow Christ. He decided that he wanted to become a priest. He began his studies. He sort of began his studies all over again as if he was a child. Eventually, he ended up at the University of Paris, the Sorbonne. It was a journey that took him almost 15 years to get to this point. But he was about to complete his studies, and he had some roommates. His roommates whom he told about this experience he had, and that he had written down about his experiences, and he taught him his way of reading, his way of experiencing the Gospels. It was really an experience of visualization. And they caught the fire too. And together they all decided that they wanted to become priests, they wanted to give their lives to Christ, and they really wanted to become missionaries. Eventually they were ordained. They were all ordained together. By this point, Ignatius was in his 40s. And he decided that, together they all decided that they wanted to be a new type of priest. And I take it that in those days, you either were sort of what we would call a diocesan priest tied to a parish, or if you were in an order like the Benedictines or the Franciscans, you lived in monasteries and had a very ordered life away from the world. Part of the genius and part of the discovery of Ignatius was an approach to the world, that he wanted the members of his society to go out and face the world and bring the gospel. Eventually they make their way to Rome and ask permission to form their own order. And they wanted to call themselves the Society of Jesus. Now, the Franciscans were named after St. Francis, and the Benedictines were named after St. Patrick. But when people heard that he wanted to name his new society after Jesus, that was felt to be pretty presumptuous. As a matter of fact, the term Jesuit was a term of derision. And how should he think, and his friends think, that that would be a proper thing? Here we are at the statue of St. Ignatius Loyola, right at the center and the heart of the campus. It's an unusual pose. I always thought it was unusual from the very first time I saw it. His head tilted up, looking towards the sky. And notice other features. He's walking away. He's leaving his sword and his shield behind him. And he's walking away. He's in motion. One of the phrases that are frequently used about the Jesuits are contemplatives in motion. They address the problems of the earth. They step right out into the cities to meet the problems and help solve the problems. And the cross of Jesus around his neck. You notice he's given up his garb as a soldier. He's given up his garb as a citizen. He's taken on the garb of the poor. And you notice it's right in the center of his neck, you will see, is the shield, the seal of the Society of Jesus. When the Society of Jesus was formed, the very first thing he did within the next year was to create that seal. And if you look at that seal later on, I'll give you a chance to look at it more closely, you realize that that seal is the very center, the very heart of the Fordham University seal. The other very interesting thing here is if you look at the way that his cloak is hanging here, this is actually a map of the world. Here we've got Florida, South America, Africa. It's an illusion of that the Society of Jesus was formed to be a missionary order, to go out around the world and spread the gospel. Now, there's a very interesting story about this, and about this statue as well. It's about how this particular statue came about. Father McShane wanted to have a statue of St. Ignatius at the centerpiece of the campus. And he learned that one of the fellows who worked in physical plant, a fellow named Christopher Velarde, as a sideline, was an amateur sculptor. And he thought that perhaps he could ask him to design this statue. But first he said he wanted to have a test case with him, because he really had no idea. The type of things that Christopher Velarde had done up until that point were objects. They were not people. And so we asked him if he could make a small copy of the statue of Archbishop John Hughes, the founder of Fordham, that stands outside the administration building, because he was looking for an award to be presented at the Founders Dinner. And Chris Velarde created a small imitation of that statue, which is presented each year at the Founders Dinner. It was a heck of a test, because then Father McShane gave him the commission to create a life-size, a greater than life-size sculpture of St. Ignatius Loyola. It was a very large bet. I don't know if I would have made a choice like that on someone who'd never done something like this before. But it's an extraordinary Fordham story that this is created of Fordham by Fordham. And you'll note that on the bottom of the stone, he stands on a special slab that reads Ad Maiorem Dei Gloria. We're going to talk about that later, but it's certainly one of the true mottos of the Society of Jesus. We had to move inside because the rains came, just as I was about to explain to you about Constitution Row. Why in the world is there a Constitution Row, the road out in front of the gymnasium? Well, it happens that in 1939, America was celebrating the 150th anniversary of the United States Constitution. And in a fervor of patriotism, the university decided that they would name that street Constitution Row. And they planted 13 giant trees there, now giant trees. They were not giant in 1939, to mark the 13 original colonies. But there's a story that fits right there, and I want to be sure to tell you that right now. Back in 1958, there was a student here at Rose Hill by the name of John Feerick, who was vice president of the student government. And one of his responsibilities as vice president was to oversee the election that took place in the spring of 1958 for next year's officers of the Fordham College student government. And as the election after the election took place, it turned out that one of the people, the fellow elected to be president, had decided that he could not take office and he was not going to accept the presidency. And so a great crisis arose, shall we say, amongst the students about who should become the president. Should the kid who was elected vice president move up, or should the boy who was defeated become president because his opposition had withdrawn? And the wrinkle in the story was that the president of the Fordham College student government was always a senior, was the honor of being a senior, and so and the fellow who would move up was only going to be a junior. And so John Feerick was very thorough and responsible, and he read the bylaws of the Fordham College student government, and he thought about how it had been presented, and he looked at how other institutions did it, and he decided that the vice president should move up and become the president. Now, after that point in time, he went to Fordham Law School, and because he'd had this experience of seeing about how an office was filled, he paid attention to the question of succession. And right after he graduated from law school, he had looked at the United States Constitution, and he realized that there were some gaps in what would happen if there were vacancies in the presidency. And he wrote a law review article and offered it to the Fordham Law Review for publication, even though he was now 1 year out of school, 2 years out of school. And normally, articles published in law reviews are written by law professors, by judges, by distinguished, long-practicing lawyers. And for this young man out of Fordham Law School to offer the article was very unusual, and to publish it was very unusual, but it was well thought out, well researched, and well written. It came out in the October 1963 edition of the Fordham Law Review. And on November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And they all went running to the books to figure out what should happen in this vacancy, who moves up, how does it work. And the only person in the last 50 years to write on this subject was this kid out of Fordham Law School, John Feerick. And he became first a counsel to the American Bar Association Committee on Presidential Succession, and then counsel to a Senate committee of the United States Senate. And he and others sat down and wrote on a legal pad the words that became the 25th Amendment to the United States Constitution. John Feerick continued practicing law. He was really a labor lawyer, but comes time at Watergate, and at Watergate time, the Vice President of the United States, Spiro Agnew, resigned, and they used the amendment to move Gerald Ford in as Vice President. Nixon resigned, Ford moved up, Nelson Rockefeller came in as Vice President. He wrote a book about this, about how all of this happened, the book of which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize in History. Some years later, he came back to Fordham to become a professor and the dean of Fordham Law School. Now I want to take you now to Keating Hall, to Keating First, to talk about the history of the Jesuits at Fordham. Now here we are in Keating Hall, first floor lecture hall. This is the cathedral of Jesuit education. When you think about the great cathedrals with their stained glass windows, and they use the stained glass to tell the stories of the Gospels. Well, here it tells the stories of the great Jesuits over the centuries. And this is really the heart of Jesuit Fordham. On the walls, we'll see stained glass windows of St. Ignatius Loyola, of St. Francis Xavier, and St. John Berchmans on one side. On the other side, it's Peter Canisius, Robert Bellarmine, and Edmund Campion. So let me pick up that story of the Jesuits. Here they now have been recognized by the Pope. They've created a seal, and I will show you as we walk around a little more when the rain stops, how the seal of the Jesuits is the center of the Fordham University seal. But at this point, the Jesuits, they had in their mind the mission was to become missionaries, to go out around the world. But they really hadn't any assignments yet. But they were trying to, they were recruiting other members. They were creating little schools to train their new members of the society. And as they did that, the peoples in the towns began to say, well, as long as you're creating a school, would you take my children to school? Would you take my young adults into school? This was not the plan, but it became sort of accidental that by demand built up, that the Jesuits began, St. Ignatius began, a series of schools. He was ordained and the society was founded when he was about age 50. He died at age 65, 15 years later. Within those 15 years, he had recruited 1,000 Jesuits and he had 23 schools in 3 different countries. It was an astonishing development. As those more and more schools developed over the years after his death, in many different countries, and in 1599, the Jesuits made a very significant decision. They brought together people from schools in 6 or 7 different countries and created a common curriculum that would be used in all of their schools. A common curriculum that was diverse. It included sciences, it included theology, philosophy, it included art, it included language. It was a diverse liberal arts curriculum. It became so incredibly popular that peoples around the world, cities around the world, began asking if the Jesuits would come and found a university in their city, because the Jesuits were recognized that they had created this ratio studiorum, as it was called, the ration of courses, this syllabus that was the envy of the world. They created simultaneously what you might say was the Tiffany's and the McDonald's of education. Because sometimes in various cities, whatever was taught in their universities differed greatly, and some were extraordinarily small, focused, nothing that we would consider today more than a trade school, whereas the Jesuits had invented and demanded and created every one of their schools around the world this broad liberal arts education that shaped not just their education, but shaped education worldwide. Schools all over the world were using the Jesuits' ratio studiorum as their curriculum. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about the history of New York. New York and how we fit into the story. New York City was actually a very small town. At the time of the Revolutionary War, there may have been about 30,000 citizens. During the war, it went down to about 25,000. By the year 1800, it may have gotten up to 35,000, maybe 40,000 citizens, all in this area. That was January 1, 1800. By January 1, 1900, New York City was 4 million people. 4 million people. That means that they moved in on the average of 1,000 new people moved in to live, not just pass through, to live in New York City, 1,000 people every week for 100 years. There was no city to move into. New York was a raucous cacophony of trying to build housing for thousands and thousands and thousands of rising citizens. And certainly by the middle of the century, they were arriving in vast numbers as there were famines in Europe that brought thousands and thousands of Irish, Italians, and others arriving at the shores. New York was teeming and overwhelmed. By 1800, there were just the first priests arriving in New York, and there were a very, very small number of priests. And John Hughes, who was the Bishop of New York by the middle of this first part of the century, he had maybe 25, 30 priests for a diocese that actually included all of New York State, all the way up to Canada, all the way out into and across New Jersey to Pennsylvania. And he only had 25 priests for all the people in that whole area. He was desperate to begin a seminary so he could have some more priests. And he wrote, for 9 years, he wrote to the Jesuits asking them if they would come and could send some of their men to create a university here in New York. But it was impossible for them. They didn't have the manpower. They didn't have the ability to do so. So John Hughes came up with the idea that he was going to start his own university. He called it St. John's College. St. John the Baptist College, actually founded on the feast of St. John the Baptist, June 24, 1841. But he had to put so many of his priests tied up trying to create the school. And then he also decided to pay for it by taking in regular students. So he not only had his seminary students, but he had his regular paying students to cover the costs. that he had no priest to send out around his immense diocese. So finally, in 1846, the Jesuits accepted his offer. They closed 2 schools, one in Maryland and one in Kentucky, and brought their Jesuits together here to New York to take over the operation of St. John's College in the village of Fordham. Story about St. Ignatius Loyola and that St. Ignatius, and the way St. Ignatius appears here in this room on Keating First. You notice that stained glass window of Ignatius up there, and notice that he has that same tilted up head, that very unusual pose that we found in the statue. Well, as I was researching doing this tour, I found a Fordham Alumni magazine from 1935 which told an astonishing story. When Keating Hall was designed in the 1930s, the president was Father Aloysius Hogan. And Father Aloysius Hogan, when he was a young Jesuit, had gone to England to study for his, to receive his PhD degree from Cambridge. And then he traveled over to the town of Loyola to see where the founder of the Jesuits had been born. And when he was there, as he walked around, he saw one statue of St. Ignatius that really caught his attention. And it was a statue that had this uplifted head. Now, it was not at a time, this was early in the 1900s, you couldn't even buy a postcard of this. So he hired a photographer to take a picture of the statue. And he kept it with him all during his years, and then he becomes president of Fordham, and he's overseeing the construction of this building. And he takes that picture, and he shows it to the architect. The architect's name was Robert J. Reilly, coincidentally, so I hope you will always remember that. And the architect uses the photograph that Father Aloysius Hogan had taken in his youth and uses it to design this window. When Christopher Lardy is commissioned by Father McShane to create a statue of St. Ignatius Loyola, Father did not tell him anything particular about what that statue was to look like. And Chris Velarde comes in here to take a look at this St. Ignatius window, and lo and behold, he has his head tilted upward. As he goes around to the University Church, he finds that they have used that same photograph as a style of behind the altar, the head tilted upward, and in other locations. And so Chris Velarde decides, well, that must be the way that, that St. Ignatius looked, although if you could easily Google St. Ignatius and you don't find anything that looks like that. It's a very, very unusual pose. And lo and behold, he decides to use that for the statue of St. Ignatius Loyola that is the centerpiece, based on the photographs that Aloysius Hogan had made 100 years before. A great Fordham story. Now we're outside by the drive-in entrance, and I just want to point out 3 things. We talked about how the Jesuit seal is a very centerpiece of the Fordham University seal, as you can see right there, and it appears at about 30 different places around campus. It's built into several of the walls of some of the buildings. Also, the name of this circle right here is Matteo Ricci Circle. Matteo Ricci was a famous Jesuit mathematician. Mathematician, studies geometry, a circle, Matteo Ricci Circle. And the road that leads out to the world is Xavier Way. Xavier, Francis Xavier, was Ignatius's roommate and best friend. And 1 year after the society was officially founded, Ignatius sent Francis Xavier out to the mission world. He sent him out to India and to Japan, probably knowing that he would never see him again. That's Xavier Way, sending our students out into the world every year. A special design feature on Keating Hall. It shows the seals of the other Jesuit schools in the New York area and across the country. Here we have the seal for St. Peter's College and for Loyola of Maryland. Up there is Regis High School. I know St. Francis Xavier High School is over here. You can find Holy Cross, you can find Georgetown, you can find Boston College, and many others as part of the design of this beautiful collegiate Gothic campus. Here we are now on the steps of Keating Terrace. And I've always admired, as I walk past, this writing up top here that shows Fordham founded in 1841, but it drew from the 2 faculties of 2 Jesuit schools that were in Maryland and in Kentucky. Kentucky dated from 1831, but St. Mary's in Maryland was founded in 1634. St. Mary's in Maryland had been in existence for 2 centuries by the time they moved up here to take over Fordham. That was longer than Fordham has been in existence now. Now, it wasn't a very large school, and I was a little bit surprised that it was even mentioned. And it was in a very remote part of the state, certainly not an urban setting. But I was reading probably in the Wikipedia or something the other day, and I realized why they made such a point about this. This school was founded in 1634. Harvard was founded in 1635. I just wanted to stop here for a moment on the steps of Freeman Hall. Freeman is the headquarters for physics and for mathematics at the university. And I wanted to point out that actually before Keating Hall was built, the university graduations took place on the steps of Freeman, and all the people sat out that way. But the seal of the university says the motto "Sapientia et Doctrina," wisdom and learning. And on the front of Keating, you see, or on the front of Freeman, I should say, you can see the lamp of learning and the wise old owl of wisdom. Right. Here we are standing at the corner of Bathgate Avenue, which runs right up from the Bronx, right into the campus, and Christopher Clavius Way, right here. Christopher Clavius was a famous Jesuit scientist. And as I thought about it, I realized that, of course, this would be called Christopher Clavius Way. Here is the Freeman Hall for physics and for mathematics. The original medical school was here in what is now Finley Hall. Mulcahy Hall was the chemistry building. Behind us is T-Baud, which was the pharmacy school, and behind that is the biology building, Larkin Hall. This was the original STEM way, science, technology, engineering, math, of 150 years ago. Now the question you're probably wondering about, and the question I haven't answered up until right now, is how many Jesuits are there at Fordham? Now I have numbers from 1 year ago because I last gave this tour a year ago and I haven't been able to be around here to gather up the numbers since. But based on the numbers of 1 year ago, how many Jesuits are there at Fordham? There are 116. 56 at Murray Weigel and Coleman, 34 at Spelman, and 26 Jesuit scholastics at Chiswick Hall. That makes it what I'm told to be the 5th largest Jesuit gathering in the world. The largest in North America, the 5th largest Jesuit communities. They consider that 3 separate communities, but they're all here on the Fordham campus. The 5th largest Jesuit communities in the world. So when people ask you whether there are any Jesuits at Fordham, you can astonish them with that number. Here we are at Duane Library in the fabulous Tagnino Hall, which is so beautiful and so evocative of collegiate life. As you enter, there's a magnificent mural of the Jesuit, about the Jesuit martyrs of North America, hence the naming of Joe's Goupil in the Land Lounge, across the way. And also this magnificent stained glass window to the liberal arts. So here I wanted to talk about some developments in education over the years. Obviously, the original curriculum has been expanded, the Ratio Studiorum, which still is the framework upon which education is built. Other things have developed out of it. One of it is the development of centers and institutes at universities. It's a topic that's rarely talked about, but it's actually where the university leaves the ivory tower and becomes part of real life. And you'd be maybe astonished to learn that there are 60 centers and institutes at Fordham, giving the faculty and the students working with them an opportunity to learn real-world experience because they're working on real-world problems and dealing with, generally with entities outside the university. And a large number of those are devoted to the subject of social justice. Now, I always took the name social justice to be sort of a general do-gooder term. And so I was quite astonished to learn that the term social justice was actually coined by an Italian Jesuit, Luigi Tapparelli, in the year about 1846, just about the year that the Jesuits took over Fordham University. It was an outgrowth of the Industrial Revolution. You realize that for hundreds of years, life went on just about the same worldwide. Most people were living basically a hand-to-mouth existence. There were a few nobles and rich people, but really the vast majority were sort of a serf-level living day to day. During the course of the Industrial Revolution, from about 1860 through about 1760 through about 1830, America and the world began to be automated and industrialized. And an outgrowth of that, aside from all the wonderful things that it produced, is that it created, for the first time in the history of the world, a middle class. A whole group of people were elevated from really a poverty level, but it left a number of people unable to rise up. And as consciousness of this arose, the feeling was that it was not fair that so many people were left behind. That was the beginning and the naming of social justice as a concept. And social justice over the intervening century became critical and a centerpiece of the Jesuit philosophy. You know, and as has been described to me as being the corporal works of mercy 2.0. It's really a whole other level of dealing with the corporal works of mercy, which has been central concept in Christianity from the very beginning. And you can find at Fordham and at all the Jesuit schools centers on social justice throughout the university, centers of social justice, particularly in these centers and institutes I was telling you about. And there's one on poverty, there's the Feerick Center for Social Justice, named after that John Feerick that I told you about very early on, who helped develop the 25th Amendment. He has devoted this part of his life to developing social justice in the legal world. Centers throughout the university on these topics. And it is really part of the character of a Fordham education. It is really part of the Jesuit character of a Fordham education that is so prominent and so much part of the warp and woof of life here that you don't even think about how unique that is. That is a very unique feature. So as you come back to campus and have an opportunity to see all the various things taking on here, including things like urban plunges for entering students as part of the admissions process, to the orientation process, to become part of understanding what the city is like. Global outreach, which sends students around the country and around the world on spring break to understand their place in the world. And now these centers for engaged learning, which are ways of bringing social justice issues into the classroom. And I was told at a recent Zoom conference that there are 52 courses now in the Fordham curriculum devoted to that subject of engaged learning, of social justice engaged learning. So there's a lot that has taken place, and a lot of this, once you recognize it, you say, of course that's the Jesuit influence. That's what's going on here. It's not just the numbers, it's not just the buildings, it's not just the seals. It's all that activity put together over all the 10 schools that are part of the fabric that makes Fordham a Jesuit university. Now let us continue on our way. Now here we are at the west entrance to Dealey Hall. You probably walked in here 1,000 times and never much thought about it. But take a close look at this magnificent wrought iron entranceway. The centerpiece is the seal of the family of the Loyola family. And the doorknobs, of course, are the ram's head, the Fordham of today. But around the outside, wrought in metal, is the Ratio Studiorum, a curriculum that the Jesuits created and had become the curriculum of all schools throughout the earth. That is a great tribute to Jesuit education worldwide. Every time you enter, remember this. Now we're standing in Queen's Court named for the Blessed Mother, the Queen of Heaven, beautiful statue behind me, and surrounded by the Queen's Court residence halls. The names are St. John's Hall, but it's really St. John the Baptist Hall. Fordham was founded as St. John's College, on the feast day of St. John the Baptist, June 24, 1841. In the center is Bishop's Hall, named for several bishops. The university was very proud that several of their alumni had become bishops spreading the faith across America. And St. Robert's Hall, St. Robert Bellarmine Hall. Remember St. Robert Bellarmine's stained glass window in Keating First? Remember Robert Bellarmine Way, leaving out from the campus center, St. Robert Bellarmine Hall. Now we're in the Fordham University Church. Many people have noticed and are aware of the fact that these beautiful stained glass windows were donated by King Louis Philippe of France to Fordham. Actually, they were originally trying to give them to St. Patrick's Cathedral, but they didn't fit the St. Patrick's Cathedral window spaces, so they came here to Fordham. You will note that actually the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are listed in French under each one. And they are stunning. But I also wanted to point out to you, and many people don't even rarely pay attention, the magnificent 14 Stations of the Cross, which were carved by Pietro Montana specifically for this university church. Incredible 14 separate, individually hand-carved artworks, 3/4 life-size, magnificent. Everyone is a treasure unto itself around this university church. So next time you're here, pay some attention because they are treasures of Fordham. Now let me take you up front and talk a little bit about Jesuits' spirituality. Also in the university church, and another one of the real treasures of the university, is the magnificent Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam organ. Here, with the Jesuit seal right on the crest, right there. I don't know if you can see that, but that organ is one of the finest in the world. It lifts up song, lifts up prayer. It is really one of the treasures of the university. And on the main altar, so we'll turn around now, I want you to see kneeling in front with that head tilted up is St. Ignatius Loyola, and on the left side in red, St. Robert Bellarmine, St. Robert's Hall, Bellarmine, Bellarmine Way, Bellarmine Chapel in Spelman Hall, the Robert Bellarmine stained glass window in Keating. One of the great doctors of the church. There have only been 36 doctors of the church at all time. He was one of the greatest theologians. Jesuits have always been very proud of him, and he is a major figure in Jesuit education. But now I'd like to talk to you about Jesuit spirituality. I have a set of twos that I wanted to talk to you about. 2 concepts, 2 practices, and 2 commandments. The 2 concepts, and the first concept was really the work of one of the primary works of St. Ignatius Loyola. Up until that point in time, when he had his conversion moment, shall we say, the world was viewed as a very, that there was either the sacred or the profane. There was very little appreciation of finding what we would now say is finding God in all things. This was really one of the great insights of St. Ignatius Loyola, realizing that it is not only a small slice of the world that you can find the presence of God, that God is active in our lives, in my life, in your life, in all lives. And it just takes opening your eyes and seeing it. So that was really one of his great insights. And from that came the second great insight. Well, if God is active in my life, and then I can also respond. And how does one respond? By doing things by intentionally doing things for the greater glory of God. Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, AMDG, which had become, in some respects, the motto of the Society of Jesus. It was a transformational insight that really has shaped all the works of the Jesuits for 500 years, of dedicating their work to the greater glory of God. Not that we can make God any greater, but it elevates us in the effort. So those are the 2 great insights. And then to talk about the 2 concepts. The second, I wanted to talk about the 2 distinctive Jesuit practices. One is what's called the spiritual exercises. When St. Ignatius Loyola was confined for those 3 years after his injury in war, and he thought about and he wrote about the experiences he was having. He called them spiritual exercises, much like the exercises you might have of health exercises and other mathematical exercises. So what was being exercised I think what was being exercised was the exercise of your imagination, of the opening of one's mind, the visualization technique, so to speak, that he used in reading the Gospels and taught his companions to use. And that is really one of the great insights of the Jesuits and of Jesuit education. And so every Jesuit is expected to do one month-long retreat using these spiritual exercises during the course of their life, as well as, and that is why oftentimes you hear about Jesuits having retreats. That is really one of the distinctive features of Jesuit education, is having, and Jesuit parishes are famous for their retreats. And the other is a practice of the Jesuits called the examen. That is a twice-a-day practice for all Jesuits every day to spend a small amount of time, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, just sort of reviewing what has gone on in their life or life around them. Where did they see God acting? Where did they see God reaching out to them? So they are aware of it every day, twice a day. And the third thing is the two great commandments. You know, probably familiar with the gospel message, gospel story of when Jesus was asked, well, what is the greatest commandment? And he astonished his questioners by not answering, well, the greatest commandment is two. One is that you should love the Lord your God with your whole heart and mind and soul. And second, that you should love your neighbor as yourself. Now, how is that expressed in Jesuit life and Jesuit education and in Jesuit life at Fordham? Number one, the expression of loving God. There's no higher expression than the sacrifice of the Mass. The sacrifice of the Mass is offered at every campus, every day, multiple times a day in normal times, and many, many times a week. And how is the love of neighbor expressed? Social justice is really the Jesuit institutionalized action of loving your neighbor as yourself. It is really what has become the foundation work of Jesuit education and the foundation of what you find at all schools and all campuses of Fordham. Now, I just want to say to you, as you walk around this campus, and I hope you will come back and visit soon, you know, when your alarm goes off in the morning, it's not to remind you about what time you set the clock last night. It's to wake you up to be ready for today and for tomorrow. As you walk around this campus and you see all these wonderful things that are going off in your mind, alerting you to the history, but not of the history of yesterday. It's the history of today and the history of tomorrow. So come back to Rose Hill, walk around, see our world with a whole new set of eyes. Thanks for coming along for our walk. Go Rams.